What's up, everybody? Back again on the Thomas Take Sports Podcast, live on GrandstandSportsNetwork.com. I'm Ryan Thomas, coming to you live today, and just wrapped up the first part of the Thomas Take today. I'm going to be doing a half an hour long show, per usual, 15-minute parts, 2 15-minute parts. Usually I do 4, because that makes an hour, obviously. But today I'm going to be running it a little bit short. I had 2 main MMA topics, combat sports topics that I want to talk about today. One of which I've already discussed, which was the thoughts on Canelo versus Triple G 2 and some of my skepticisms about it, some of my positives about it. You can tune into that on GrandstandSportsNetwork.com. You can tune into that on that site. It is fantastic what they're doing, promoting these podcasts, giving guys like me a platform to, reach out to an audience. It's fantastic. And some of the people that I've talked to, whether it be on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, even Instagram, I've had some followers. It's been really cool. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I really appreciate it. Thank you to Grandstand Sports Network for allowing yours truly to have a platform to reach out to a greater audience. I really appreciate it. So, that being said, there has been a fantastic, fascinating freak story that has been lurking in the underground masses of mixed martial arts for the last, I want to say, 3 months. Maybe 6 months. But realistically, that wouldn't be fair. To say 3 months, to say 6 months, neither one would be accurate. Let's just say since 2010, we're in 2018, for the last 8 years. And the reason why I say 8 years is due to a lot of reasons. That was the last time that Chuck Liddell, the Iceman, the former UFC light heavyweight champion, stepped back into the cage for the Ultimate Fighting Championship. It was a fight versus Rich Franklin in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, obviously. And Chuck Liddell was doing very well in the fight on the early onset of the bout, looked to be in very good shape, was winning the fight, had thrown a body kick that landed on I believe the left arm of Rich Franklin that broke his arm. Which Rich was a southpaw, so that's like his best, most dominant hand, most dominant arm in a fight. And Rich Franklin fired a short right hand, straight right, as Chuck Liddell was closing in on him, and it sent Chuck Liddell crumbling to the canvas, knocked out cold. And that was the last we saw of the Iceman Chuck Liddell. So at that point, it was obvious Chuck Liddell was going to retire. This was going to be a fight where we knew if he won, he might stick around a little longer. If he lost, he's done. And if he lost by knockout, viciously, he was done. And that's what happened. What is often forgotten about, because there's been an influx of new fans in the sport of mixed martial arts since then. Obviously, you have the female demographic due to the Ronda Rouseys, the Holly Holmes, the Misha Tates, the Cyborgs of the world, Rose, Joanna, Valentina, Amanda Nunes, all the just massively talented women in the sport of mixed martial arts. Then you have the Conor McGregor era, the influx of talent, John Jones. The UFC is completely different from 2010 until now. It is for better or for worse, and I've talked about that in previous podcast episodes. It's bigger, it's better, but there's also oversaturated market, too many events, things like that. I've talked about that at nauseum, so I'm not going to go into that quite yet. I'll talk about that at another time. But the original fight, which was billed for months and months and months, the last fight of Chuck Liddell's career was originally supposed to be versus Tito Ortiz. And it's well known that Chuck and Tito have probably the greatest rivalry in the history of the sport. I think, for my money, it's in large part the reason why we are even talking about the sport. 15 years, almost 15 years after the first season of The Ultimate Fighter. That season was coached by Chuck and Randy, but there was a trio of guys, Chuck, Randy, and Tito. And those three guys brought so much mainstream attention to the sport that the next thing that they could latch on was a reality show. The reality show spawned what we know as the Ultimate Fighting Championship, the UFC today. But Chuck and Tito's rivalry was stuff of legend. So they're doing another season of The Ultimate Fighter, Team Liddell versus Team Ortiz, which he later, turned into Team Punishment, as Tito would do, gloating about his clothing brand. And and everyone was looking forward to that fight. And for everyone to look forward to a fight where Chuck had beaten Tito 2 times, that just goes to show you how much of a draw their rivalry was. The fact that they could still sell something where Chuck had beaten Tito twice by knockout, both times, and they're ready to fight a third time. It didn't happen. Chuck Liddell, or Tito Ortiz, had to pull out during the show with a neck injury. Dana had to tell him that he was off the show, and that was that. Tito kind of bounced around the UFC for a little while longer, won some fights. Chuck retired after he had lost to Rich Franklin. So their careers went 2 separate ways. Chuck retired. Tito bounced around in the UFC a few times, and then went over to Bellator and had almost like a second career over there. Won some fights, got paid, walked out of the sport with a win versus Chael Sonnen in January of 2017. So he fought a lot longer than Chuck did. Years. He took that break there, I think, from 2010 to 2013, but came back. Somewhere in there was a retirement. I've lost track of how many times Tito has stepped away and come back. But for a while now, ever since the UFC laid off thousands and thousands of employees, whether it be in Canada, whether it be in China, whether it be in the United States, one of those guys, believe it or not, was Chuck Liddell. So Chuck Liddell had a cushy desk job with the UFC, a talent evaluator, scout, whatever you want to call it, and he got fired. The new ownership said, we don't need these people in these positions anymore. The job was basically, it was a job to do nothing and be a brand ambassador for the UFC, and even Chuck Liddell would even admit that. But he gets the axe, and for a guy like Chuck Liddell who knows nothing but fighting, what does he do from there? He can go on reality shows, he can go on certain things and make extra side cash and things like that. But the main way for Chuck Liddell to make money is fighting, because that's all he knows. He's not a commentator. He's just not that guy. So for the last, I'd say, year and a half now, things have really started to heat up as far as whether or not Chuck Liddell is going to come back. And I think he is. I actually think he is. I want to let it be known that I think he is going to come back, because there's too much money in it for him not to come back. I definitely think Chuck misses the attention. And he misses the things that all fighters miss when they're retired, or all athletes miss when they're retired. And the only guy that I think he would come back to fight, there were rumblings about Chael Sonnen, they had a beef, things like that. But I think Tito is the only guy that makes sense. And for a while, Chuck would say, well, remember the last time he pulled out, I think he's scared, he lost to me twice, he doesn't want to fight me again. Well, now Tito's saying that he will. And Tito's saying that he wants to do it in the UFC, which I have a huge problem with that. Tito, as I alluded to earlier, left the UFC, always had a bitter relationship with Dana White, and made a lot of money over in Bellator. Scott Coker put him on a pedestal, really, that he didn't deserve to be on, and made him somewhat the early face of Bellator. And now he's saying he wants to fight in the UFC, the third final fight versus Chuck to be in the UFC. Why could this fight not be in Bellator? This fight would be great for Bellator. I don't think the UFC has any interest in putting on this third trilogy fight, because the UFC then is completely different from the UFC today. They want new, fresh, young, hungry stars. They don't want to revert back to the past. They're done with the days of Chuck. They're done with the days of Tito. They're done with the days of Rich. They're almost done with the days of, well, they probably will be done with the days of Anderson Silva. I go on and on and on. On and on and on. They're done. I mean, the only guy that they've let come back time and time again is B.J. Penn, and look how that's worked out. I think B.J. Penn could say 5 times that he's regretted coming back and fighting, and that's sad. But the reality is that these guys don't know how to do anything else. They weren't meant to do anything else but what they had originally found that they could do from the age of 15 to 40. And that's a life. That's your prime of your life. So what I'm saying here is I do think that this has legs. I think I'm seeing it grow. I'm seeing it grow on Twitter. I'm seeing it grow on Facebook. I'm seeing it grow on all the underground MMA forums. I'm seeing this grow, and the reason why it's growing is because these are 2 of the biggest names in the history of the sport, and they still feel as if they have something left to prove. They still feel as if they're going to fight. They have beef still after almost 20-some years, over 20-some years. So I really think that this fight's going to happen. Why not? I would sit down, tell me when and where. I will sit down, turn the TV on, and watch it. And enjoy it. And you want me to pick a winner? I'd pick Chuck again. What would implore me not to pick Chuck again to beat Tito? There are some guys out there that are just one man's kryptonite. Rich Franklin's was Anderson Silva, DC's is John Jones, and Tito Ortiz's was Chuck Liddell was Tito Ortiz's kryptonite. Holly Holm was Ronda Rousey's kryptonite. I could go on and on. But I really think that the fans would watch this fight because in the sport of MMA, it doesn't matter how many losses you have. It doesn't matter how old you are. It matters if you can check off one box, and that is if a fan wants to see you fight, and that answer is yes. You fight for as long as you can. Dan Henderson is the prime example of that. Randy Couture is another example of that. Even Tito Ortiz is another example of that. Vanderlei Silva is another example of that. Mirko Krokop is another example of that. And obviously Chuck Liddell is another example of that. He had lost his title to Rampage Jackson. That was back in 2007. And he said, the only thing that's keeping me in this is the title. Well, when he lost enough fights and he wasn't in line for a title anymore, why was he still fighting? Because that is what he loves to do. And that's what he is known to do. So I think that this is gaining real steam, but the only thing I have in terms of whether this fight should happen or not, it needs to happen in Bellator, because this is a brand that's trying to grow. It's a brand that is growing, and I do not think the UFC has any interest in this fight. I think they did 8 years ago, but that ship sailed, and Bellator is in the business of putting on fights that some people say are freak shows. Some people say that it's fighters, UFC washouts, all that stuff. Some of it might be true. But what the idea is, putting 2 guys on a main event, knowing that these are the 2 guys on the main event, and putting your stable of fighters underneath them. That way, when these people are tuning in to see Chuck versus Tito 3, and they're waiting for it, knowing that that's the last fight, then as the card goes along, fight after fight after fight after fight, the fans, you're getting eyeballs to your roster. And that's the idea. Chuck Liddell versus Tito 3, Rory McDonald versus Lima 2, however they've done it. They've done it so many times. They did it recently with Rampage and Chael. Rampage and Chael with a main event. They had a title fight as the co-main event. They did that because they're verging groupings of audiences within the sport. People that are pro-UFC can turn on Bellator and say, well, we're going to watch these 2 fight. They never fought in the UFC. And that's how they're doing it. And it works. I wouldn't be shocked to see it. Tell me when and where. I'll get my popcorn ready. I'm Ryan Thomas. It was the Thomas Take. Take care.